Every war leaves the world worse off than it found it. War is a failure of politics and humanity, a shameful surrender, a defeat in the face of the forces of evil.
Can a pope stop a war? During World War II, Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, ridiculed the Vatican's diplomatic efforts by mockingly asking, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" Several decades later, the Soviet Empire had collapsed, but the Pope's diplomatic service remains active today.
Well, the popes have been calling for peace on an international platform since at least the beginning of the 20th century. Pope Benedict XV tried and failed to bring a negotiated end to the First World War. Half a century later, Pope St. Paul VI went to the United Nations and famously called for no more war. And his successors have followed suit.
Pope Francis's diplomacy extends beyond his weekly calls for peace from St. Peter's Square during general audiences.
Dobbiamo fare tutti gli sforzi per trattare, per negoziare.
In 2024, the pontiff attended the G7 summit in Italy, where he advocated for a new ethical code to address the challenges posed by artificial intelligence.
Pope Francis's signature contribution has been to link military conflict to social justice questions and particularly the environment. He wrote Laudato, his encyclical in 2015, and he talked about how the environmental degradation hits the poor particularly, and he linked it to conflict. Just the other day, he was talking to some Italian teachers, and he told them to discourage bullying by their students because that, he said, was a preparation for war, not for peace.
Of course, the Pope's speech to the diplomatic corps is not the only avenue that he has to speak to the important diplomatic issues of our day. The Pope also uses his weekly general audiences and Angelus addresses to speak to the issues of the day, and often uses these public speeches to make an impassioned plea for peace.
The Vatican is also working in the background, not only by sending humanitarian aid, but also as a mediator between the warring parties.
Oggi la diplomazia è molto svalutata.
Today diplomacy is very devalued. Today is the time of arms. There is no talk of dialogue, there is just confrontation. The Pope and the Holy See know that, and the fact that the Pope Francis sent Cardinal Zuppi to Kiev, to Moscow, to Washington, to Beijing, to talk about peace and humanitarian issues shows just a sign of his own.
The Holy See is one of the great advantages, perhaps its great advantage as a diplomatic actor, is that it is neutral. It's sovereign but non-aligned, and that allows it to communicate with different sides in a conflict. In 2014, the Pope Francis was very instrumental in facilitating a rapprochement between the U.S. and Cuba.
The Holy See has an enormous diplomatic network and relations with more than 180 sovereign states. But sometimes, even the Pope's diplomacy reaches its limits.
The Vatican was also facing a decades-long dispute with Beijing over the appointment of bishops. In 2018, the Holy See signed a provisional agreement with the Chinese government on the appointment of bishops. And right from the start, this was not a smooth process. Almost immediately after this agreement was signed, there were reports of increased persecution of the underground Catholic community in China. And in 2022, the Vatican revealed that Beijing had violated the terms of its agreement with the Holy See.
Pope Francis's diplomatic style is an extension of his leadership style, and so we might call it approachable, spontaneous, informal, very personal. He can be very blunt, as when he talks about investigating Israel for terrorism in Gaza. But he can also be capable of being silent when he thinks it's necessary. For example, he's refrained from criticizing China for human rights violations, presumably because he wants to pursue this rapprochement with China.
But to this day, the Pope is the preeminent religious figure in the world, and he still has global moral authority.
Il Papa non smetterà fino all'ultimo.
The Pope will not stop until his last breath. He will keep talking about peace. The risk is that we get used to war. And in this sense, it seems to me that Pope's voice on peace is a bit like the rooster crowing and awakening Peter. The humanity has become like Peter, become a slave to violence, accustomed to violence.
Abituata alla violenza.
Penso a quanto sia urgente.
But Pope Francis is convinced that even the best diplomacy alone will not save the world. It needs more, namely, the help of God.
Chiediamo allora al Signore.
Let us ask the Lord that the leaders of nations and the parties in conflict may find the way to peace and unity. May we all recognize each other as brothers and sisters.